Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this mixed media rose painting process. Just ignore that blue drip in the middle of the canvas. I didn't realize that I didn't have any just like cheap little 11 by 14 inch canvases, and the only one that I had this drip of paint going down the center, so I was like, oh whatever, I'm just gonna paint over it. So that wasn't an intentional drip, it just happened to be there at the beginning, and I do end up just covering it up. But I liked kind of having the blue in there, so that played into it just a tad. So right now all I'm doing is getting some color on the canvas, just creating some color shifts, and I don't really have a plan going into this. The background is always more of a free-flowing thing when it comes to mixed media, and then it's how the subject is going to play off of that background. One of the most important things that I do when I start a painting, especially a mixed media painting, is just getting the white out of the canvas. And sometimes this can just be with two colors, but in this case I wanted to play around with a lot of different colors because I really wasn't sure where I was going to go with the painting. So just getting these blocks of colors in was an important part of this process. Not that you'll see them later as just giant blobs of color, because there are so many layers that are going to be put on top of this. Mixed media for me is an extremely layered process, and seeing some of those bottom layers show through to the top layers is kind of an important part of it for me. It creates depth and dimension in the painting, but also just having a lot of different textures is kind of fun. It creates a lot of interest within the painting itself. So just going in there and having a free mind and free flowing is kind of the way that I'm going about this at the moment. And just blending a couple of areas with a dry brush and whatnot. Once I get this pretty messy and colorful background down, I decided that maybe some drips would be a good idea. So I let the first layer dry completely, and then I start adding some heavily watered paint and use a spray bottle and some water in order to get some drips onto the canvas. And I do like the effect of drips because once again it adds another bit of texture to it. And then I go on to adding some stencils. So it is like the next layer, add some stencils, get a little bit more patterning in there. And this is something that I did with a sponge roller. And the sponge roller is great if you don't have access to spray paint, or you don't really feel like having to block off parts of your painting and you don't want to have too many of those, stencil polka dots everywhere. You just want them in some strategic places. I like the foam roller, and it works really well for that application. I also added some acrylic inks and just kind of made some paint splatter on there, and then took the excess off with a little bit of paper towel. And this is it's like one of those blender brushes, and that's also good for applying some of the transparents and getting some stencils on that way. I ended up putting some stencils over in this area and not liking them too much, so I just took the blender brush and kind of blended that area in, and then I ended up really liking kind of that darker color that it created at the bottom, which was, once again, it's like, it's intuitive, it's not really planned, and it created a little bit more of interest in the painting. And I really liked that kind of color playing off of the blue. It was like this orange going into red, and then it looked really nice. I kind of enjoyed that. So this is, once again, one of those things that happens sometimes during paintings is like, oops, oh, that's kind of cool, I'm gonna play off of that now. And once that had dried completely, then it was time to sketch in the rose. Now that the rose is sketched onto the canvas, I really wanted to establish where things were so I could see them, because I knew that I wanted to work on the background a little bit more. So I start putting in some of the darker areas so I know where the sides of the bottle are and I know where the leaves are, and I'm just getting some of the darks in so that I can put highlights on them at a later time. But knowing where these kind of landmarks are on the painting were kind of important, because I knew that I did want to put more stuff into the background, but I didn't want to cover up my drawing. So getting the darkest parts of the rose in place was actually an important kind of step in this whole process. And then once I got the center of the rose, I was like, oh, I really can't see my lines very well. So I took a wet brush and then removed some of the paint so I could still see the petals on the inside of the rose. These are some of my favorite things: iron lac markers and Sakura solid paint markers. I love using both of these for any kind of mark making, because you get this really cool crayon effect with the solid paint markers, and then the iron lac markers have this amazing coverage, and once they dry, they don't move. Sometimes with any other kind of markers, you add any kind of water or anything to them and they tend to get a little bit faded, or they spread, they bleed. But these markers are great. If you just let them dry completely, they will not move. And they come with all different size nibs and they're refillable. I love them. Now that I have the background the way that I want it for now, it's time for me to start painting in the rose. Now, I do fully intend to finish this painting with oil paint, so my most important objective at the moment is just to get kind of the darks and the lights in where I need them to be, because I want the rose to look pretty realistic. So I just play back and forth with the values of the pinks and also adding some yellows into certain areas so that I get some of that peachy vibe to it, a little bit of the orange kind of inner petals. And I am using a reference that I found on unsplash.com for the actual rose. I really liked this photo because it had so much of the contrast between the lighter petals and the darker petals, and I even emphasized that or enhanced it just a little bit more and made the lights a little bit brighter and some of the pinks just a little bit brighter pink, and it really is a good combination. And I used fluorescent pink to make those pinks pop even more, because you'll be able to see those colors through the transparent oils that get put on top of it. So it gives that color saturation even more of a boost once you add the oils to it. Okay, so now it's time for a little bit of contrast. Right now it just looks very pale and lacking in any kind of darks. So adding some of the leaves, the stems, I added a little bit of a rosebud that's going behind the flower. That wasn't in the original reference, but you know, artistic license being what it is, you can pretty much do whatever you want with your paintings. So I wanted to have these leaves be really, really dark so that they would stand out against the lighter background. But I didn't want to use pure black. So what I did was I made a combination of black and cadmium yellow in order to create a very, very dark green. And we wouldn't be complete without having a stem going down the center of the bottle. And the bottle is one of those things that, because it's transparent, you'll be able to see the stem, but you also will be able to see the background through it. So it was important for me to have a lot of those background colors showing through the bottle in order to create the illusion of it actually being glass. Just putting a little bit more of the mark making in with some acrylic paint, and then this is the finished acrylic portion of the painting. So the first thing that I do when I start off with oil paint is I basically want to do some glazing and create a little bit more saturation in the background. So I make the reds and oranges a little bit deeper, I create a little bit more of a cool blue that's behind the rose, and I add some of the cools to the background in order to help it recede. And then I start adding some of the darker highlights onto various leaves and making them pop forward just a little bit more, and continue this back and forth between the background and the foreground. If I think that a color needs to be changed slightly in the background, then I can enhance it by glazing over it, or I can add a little bit of opaque color to the background in order to lighten things up. I do this with sort of these yellow areas where I take a little bit of that almost Indian yellow color out and just put patches of a brighter yellow in the background, and then I go on to the rose. So the most important part is to create that depth within the rose and have the inside of it recede. So I use cool reds, and they're transparent reds, in order to make the inside of the rose look like it's almost cavernous and has these petals that are coming out from the ball of that rose. And that's a really important thing, because I do want the rose to look like there are deeper parts of it and then have the petals kind of emerging from that center. And you can really see how that color saturation works with going over those brighter pinks with that fluorescent red that's underneath it. It makes those colors so much more vibrant. And then once again, we don't want just a straight up pink rose, so I want to add some of those warmer, peachier colors on the petals that are coming most forward so that they really kind of pop towards you. And then the last thing I do is I put the brightest highlights onto the rose petals. And now I can call this rose completed. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you really enjoyed this whole process, and I will see you next time.